All right, what happened at Kokopellis?
Just the facts. The mayor, the police chief, they think this violent behavior by the Troy police was warranted and appropriate. These are the facts. Just the facts.
My name is Ben Brucato. I'm a father, resident of Troy, doctoral candidate at RPI, online instructor for Northern Arizona University, and an adjunct at Union College. I have been working on issues related to police brutality and surveillance, both as a community activist and as an academic researcher. So I've worked in my community organizing around issues related to this, but I've also done academic research that have been published in both popular press and peer-reviewed academic journals. So what happened at Kokopellis on Friday evening, more technically on Saturday morning, at some point in the evening there was a skirmish, a reported skirmish either inside and or outside of the club, something that caused the officers to come to the venue. And what's actually happened at that point is a bit unclear. The officers claim they received calls that there was a fight. But what we do know comes from speaking with patrons, eyewitnesses, and citizens in the area, as well as from a number of angles in the security tapes shot within the club, and then cell phone footage that was shot outside the venue and inside the venue, about what happened when the police actually did arrive. What did actually happen when the police arrived on scene, and the security footage shows this rather clearly, is that the bar had recently been closed and that people were finishing their drinks, grabbing their coats from coat check, and leaving in a very, very orderly fashion. It seemed to be at a leisurely pace, but it didn't seem to be a problem for anybody involved. The security inside, the owner, the bartenders didn't seem to be rushing people along, but they were definitely exiting at a fairly normal pace, anything you would typically see at the end of the night when a bar closes. And on the security footage, what you also see is that there is no evidence of a fight or any kind of skirmishes or any tension. People were acting very leisurely, both in exiting and in finishing their drinks, grabbing their coats, talking to friends and stuff like that. So pretty calm scene. The police arrive on the scene, and you can see them standing against one of the walls, talking with one another, exchanging some conversation with some of the patrons. What you see in this footage is a point where that kind of calm ends, and it's difficult to understand what happens. Clearly some words were exchanged between an officer and one or more patrons. And the friends of one of the patrons who was speaking to an officer kind of pushed him back towards the wall and covered his mouth, and he calmed down. There was like clearly a good bit of time had passed where he was sitting back against the wall again, and there was a separation between him and the officers. And this person was later identified as Rashawn Donley. He's the one who was arrested and received some of the most serious injuries on the evening. He had numerous head injuries and had to have staples in his head and so on and so forth. So anyway, at this point, there were words between he and the officer, and that situation had kind of de-escalated and it was over. However, then an officer approached him. Donley was seated against the wall, kind of like getting in his face and pointing in his face. And as soon as Rashawn Donley responded to this officer, the officer threw a punch and hit him either in the neck or in the head. That's kind of what you see on the video. So at that point then, a number of officers stormed in to the situation, grabbed Donley, I think grabbed somebody else. And at that point it's very difficult to see details, but you see a lot of officers with nightsticks and clubs kind of hitting Donley and other people. Piecing together the cell phone videos with the security videos, you can see kind of what's happening here is a number of the patrons are immediately rushing towards the door. Police are trying to force them out the door, and all the while beating them with batons. So they're trying to leave the door, but you see them kind of randomly swinging and hitting people with batons as they're leaving the establishment. At the same time, they were still hitting Rashawn Donley. So there it appeared to be two separate locations where there was kind of violence by the police officers towards the patrons. One was at the entrance where people were trying to leave. The other was with Donnelly about 10-15 feet inside the entrance where he was kind of on the floor and being struck. At that point, somebody discharges a fire extinguisher towards the entrance where there was a cluster of people trying to leave and police officers hitting them. You can't see who did that. The officers are claiming it wasn't them, and it doesn't seem reasonable that it would be them. It was likely a staff member or another patron of the establishment, and it would seem to be that their intention with doing that was to break up a skirmish or a fight, and it was actually rather effective at doing that. Immediately after the fire extinguisher was discharged, the crowd breaks up, and the violence that was occurring on the part of the officers towards the patrons had completely de-escalated for the most part. They were still holding on to Rashawn Donnelly's arm, but they were no longer striking him, and all the officers had moved away from the door and the patrons were moving out. So there was another de-escalation at this point that happens with the fire extinguisher. And then what you see, and it's best shown on a cell phone video, is Rashawn Donnelly is looking exasperated, just bewildered and confused at what had just happened. He's pleading with staff members behind the bar and other patrons. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know why this was happening. And you can see the look on his face was just of confusion. It clearly wasn't an expression of aggression or anything of that nature. Within moments, Rashawn Donnelly is tackled again by the officers, and then he's struck by at least 2 or 3 of them, while another 2 or 3 are kind of holding him down. So he's prone on the ground, receiving multiple blows to the body with the batons at that point. Shortly thereafter, he's handcuffed and left prone on the ground. So that's what the surveillance footage shows pretty clearly. Again, it's shot at multiple angles. There's cell phone video documenting this. There's a lot of other statements that have been made in the press about what's happened, about bottles being thrown, trash cans being thrown, pepper spray being used against officers, and so on and so forth. Anything like that occurred is not what happened in the context of Donnelly being abused. It's possible. It's possible that something like that occurred in a different area, perhaps outside around the bar, perhaps in the bar at many moments removed from this situation. But within a period of about 15 minutes of contiguous surveillance footage from this incident, you see nothing of that sort happening. You see police exclusively as the aggressors against people who at most were very minimally resistant to following commands that probably were somewhat unreasonable. Any of the resistance they were offering certainly didn't warrant the kind of response from officers. So one of the things that I could comment on about this is, because my research is in the area of policing and especially the use of force, is that I'm quite familiar with the Department of Justice standards and other law enforcement standards for the use of force continuums. From everything that you can see in the footage from the club, at most, anything that could be claimed would be active resistance on the part of Donnelly or any of the people being arrested, and even that might be a stretch. So at most, some sort of body tactics, perhaps pepper spray or a taser might be appropriate. Very few departments ever recommend using nightclubs in this situation, and when they are to be used, they're only to be used again in those kinds of body manipulation techniques, so moving of limbs and things like that, typically not with striking, especially because there's 2 levels of resistance or compliance above that active resistance, and that's called aggressive resistance, and that's actually striking or attempting to cause severe physical harm to the officer or another person. And that's where nightsticks might be allowed, but even still then, the nightsticks cannot strike the kidneys, the groin area, or the head. Especially the kidneys and the head, when strikes are used to those locations, that's considered deadly force. It's the same as using a handgun, ramming with a car, and so on and so forth. And the only time that deadly force is authorized by the Department of Justice, again, we're talking within the laws that govern their policies and their actions, not just our community standards of decency, which we might consider to be even more extensive than these. But nonetheless, deadly force is reserved for when an officer or a civilian has an immediate risk of death or severe bodily injury. Those are the only times when a nightstick should ever be used, striking to the head or torso area on a suspect, because that's considered to be deadly force. And clearly there was no indication whatsoever that any civilian present around the time when Donnelly and the others were arrested and beaten inside the club. Never a time when there was any immediate risk of death or severe injury to anybody. And so what we see on these tapes very clearly is the use of high levels of force, potentially even deadly force against civilians, when at most there was a passive or maybe active resistance. And again, I'm saying at most, because they seem to be compliant. And even if they weren't, that also begs the question of whether the orders that were issued were lawful orders to begin with. And any resistance subsequent to a lawful order, clearly understood, then can potentially be a criminal act. But nonetheless, resisting arrest never justifies the level of force that was shown here, unless that resistance is far more aggressive than what was depicted on the videotapes. There's a number of other issues as well. So we're advocating for a civil rights investigation into the Troy Police Department for this kind of pattern of civil and human rights abuses on the part of their officers. But the calls for action are broader than that. For instance, I'm calling for a reform in the documentation of use of force incidents by the police department here, following best practices in the public administration research as well as the police sciences research, which I'm very well familiar with. And in fact, the regulators in this city and other cities should be very well aware of this as well. However, the policies of this department are very far out of line with the best practices of departments that are adequately responding to patterns of abuse and negligent or reckless use of force.
I am not resigning. I have no intentions of resigning. There's no reason for me to resign. They've called for my resignation. They've called for the immediate suspension of officers involved in this incident, and that's not going to happen either.
These are not extreme proposals. These are the kinds of things that the chiefs of police and the best departments in the country have already offered up and put into place themselves. These are not radical proposals. This is what we should expect from any police department as a bare minimum of quality service to the public. If they're not willing to document every use of force incident and subject that to audit and scrutiny, they probably shouldn't be carrying around deadly weapons and have the authority to essentially generate law in the moment when they issue commands to the public.
Well, thanks a lot, Ben. Let's hope police violence in Troy ends now.